All right, and it is time, and we are super excited to have you here for today's session on procuring accessibility technology. My name is Pia Zaragoza, and I'm a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow detailed to the Department of Homeland Security, as well as Air Force Ventures. Today, we're going to talk about so many different things about procuring accessible technology, and we're going to hear from amazing panelists Mike Gifford, Justin Proctor, and Ken Nakata. Just know that at any point, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we'll answer it towards the end. And if you haven't done so already, once again, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your company, and your superpower. If you're excited about anything that we talk about today and want to get more involved, please know that TTS, which is the Technology Transformation Services and the General Services Administration, we're hiring. And you can find out more about opportunities to work on these exciting areas at join.tts.gsa.gov. I also want to put a note in that the White House Presidential Innovation Fellowship, the application has just opened up, and tune in for the Digital Corps. Sign up for their mailing list to learn more about that fellowship as well, which applications will be opening up in the future. Without further ado, I would love to do a round of introductions with our esteemed panelists today. So it'd be great if everybody could introduce themselves with their name, their role, and their superpower. So let's get started. Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Excellent. So Mike Gifford, now with Civic Actions. Previously, I was with Open Concept Consulting, and my superpower is being tenacious. That's it. Ken, do you want to go next?
Oh, sure. I'll go next. My name is Ken Nakata. I'm a principal at Converge Accessibility. We do digital accessibility and web accessibility. I'm a lawyer, and so my superpower is being a pest and making people do things that they don't want to do. Justin?
And is my volume on?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Awesome. My name is Justin Proctor. My pronouns are he, him. I work at TTS along with Pia, and I have a few roles. I'm a contracting officer. I am a co-lead of the Accessibility Guild here, and I'm also blind. And so apologize in advance if you hear my screen reader talking over people during the session, but that's what I deal with. So we can all deal with it together. And my superpower, one of my many superpowers, is I can get excited about anything. You can give me a penny and I'll make that sound very excited. So that's me. Yeah.
All right. Well, to kick this off, it'd be great if we could level set. And so the panelists, what is accessibility and what is procurement? Perhaps, Justin, you can start us off.
Absolutely. So there are variations of accessibility in the definitions, and there are a lot of good ones. So I started picking at a few, and I found a really good one that really speaks to me for accessibility, which I'm going to emphasize the word process throughout the session today, but accessibility is the process to which
And we had
first technical failure.
Yes.
Off the time.
Okay, are you back, Justin?
Oh, did I?
We lost you for just a second. Perhaps you could start from the beginning.
Yeah. So accessibility is a process to which people can fully participate or use a product or service, as well as be part of an environment. I was saying that I'm going to use the word process a lot because sometimes people think accessibility, once you make a product or service, that's it. But we'll learn throughout the session that it's an ongoing thing that needs to be done from the beginning and throughout the life cycle. And for procurement, same thing. There are a lot of different definitions. If you look at the Federal Acquisition Regulation, because I come from the procurement side, it's the process of acquiring a supplier or service by contract for products, services, construction, either through a purchase or leasing. It can be new, it could be something existing and modified. And again, talk about the process. It starts from the beginning where you define what the need is, the requirement, who should be involved, again, from the get-go. Who are your technical folks? Who knows, the design? And through the phases of solicitation, award, and especially post-award, which sometimes people think, all right, we got the contract awarded, we're done. But with accessibility, you can make a simple upgrade and update, and all of a sudden, it's no longer working. Or as our colleague Robert Jolly says, it's broken.
Thank you, Justin. Mike and or Ken, anything you want to add to that definition on accessibility and procurement?
I definitely think about accessibility as a journey, just like you would for security or, for that matter, performance or sustainability. It's not something that's over. It's an ongoing process of making sure you're able to keep up with the evolving nature of the internet. And as far as procurement, I mean, so much of this is about buying stuff. And when you're dealing with civic tech procurement, it's about dealing with a country's or province's largest purchaser. So that purchaser has a huge impact on the whole ecosystem of technology that an organization or that a country manages. And so that's how I see procurement in this context.
Yeah, I agree with everybody's definition. It's just, I think about accessibility also from the perspective of risk management in terms of like what's going to get somebody sued. And in that context, I often think about accessibility in terms of standards, and it's unfortunate that I end up going down that road, but ultimately you have to have some measure of accessibility. So there's this difference that I come up against every day, which is accessibility when it comes to meeting standards and accessibility when it comes to actually making something work for somebody with a disability. And sometimes they sync up really well, and sometimes they don't sync up really well. And that's where you end up with some gaps that are really unfortunate.
Ken, that brings me to my next question. And going into that a little bit more, what do you think the role of the civic tech community is in accessibility? And perhaps, Mike, you can start us off.
So I think that the civic tech plays a really important role, because this is where a lot of the policies and design ideas are founded for innovation and change for modern government technology are being founded in that civic tech space. With ideas of openness and collaboration. Those are really important elements of civic tech and really important aspects of accessibility. But if civic tech is not involving accessibility, if there isn't a commitment to accessibility in our projects and in our processes, then we're excluding people from the communities that we're part of. And I think that's something that there's been a lot of discussion around diversity in the civic tech space, and trying to make sure that there is greater inclusion and diversity in our communities. But it's an area where so often people with disabilities are excluded from these realms because the technology just isn't built to include them, and that's really something where we're blocking people out from participation. And that is partly in the digital space, but also on the physical space as well. How many of the brigade meetups that we go to are being held in spaces that you can't get access to if you have a wheelchair? So I think that again, it is part of, we are excluding people in our process because we haven't been intentionally inclusive as the process of building our civic tech communities.
Thanks for that, Mike. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say that it's really a partnership, I think, in order to really boost accessibility. And it has to be a partnership between civic tech and government, because as Mike said, I think that the private sector has to be the one that comes up with these really cool innovations in terms of the technologies, but we need somebody at the end of the day to set the standard in terms of which one of those cool accessibility features do we want to see as ultimately become mainstreamed into our products. And in that sense, things like Section 508 really set a good bar at that, because they force the government to buy, well, not force, but they actually do. You can get sued if you're a federal agency under 508. They require that the government buy these things that are more and more accessible, and that just creates this incentive for the private sector to incorporate more and more accessibility features.
Justin, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I absolutely agree, and I think the word that comes, or the term that comes to mind, is human-centered design, right? Like what's out there in the community, and I know here at TTS we've been really focused on doing that from initiation and trying to build that and bake that into the process. So absolutely agree with the both of them on that.
Just a quick note on in terms of follow-up, that there's a lot of startups that are thinking that they can deal with accessibility afterwards, but the more you start building a project, the further it is towards actually coming with a full launch of your project, the harder it is to actually build accessibility in. So if you can include that from the beginning, it is just so much more likely that you're going to be successful, and you're not going to have to spend a huge amount of effort to try and retrofit the structures you've built that have excluded people from your designs.
And Mike, thanks for that. That totally leads into the next question, which is, how does procurement drive accessibility in technology? Ken, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I sort of did by jumping the gun on that last question. So things like Section 508, which requires that the government buy products that meet up with certain accessibility standards, really forces all the other people that are not the ones who are innovating in accessibility to come up to a minimum standard for accessibility. And over time, then, as the innovators come up with newer stuff, then ultimately those Section 508 standards, or standards like 508, like EN 301549 in Europe, for instance, those other standards end up incorporating the ideas into those standards, and then ultimately it ends up driving the ones who can't afford to do the bleeding edge innovation and accessibility to also meet up with some basic higher levels of accessibility. So it just keeps raising the bar in theory, higher and higher.
Yeah, I definitely agree in theory that that's the way it's supposed to work. I'm not sure that in practice it often does, because there's a real disconnect, because people use the VPAT, or the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, as the primary means to convey how accessible a product or service is, but the VPAT isn't really designed for. It's mostly a sales document. It's not machine readable. It's not shareable. There's nowhere in the U.S. government that there's a directory of all of the software that a department uses that allows them to determine, just to know how the accessibility of their products and services are. I would really expect that at this stage that some government in the world would be able to have some resource that would allow them to identify what the barriers are of the software that they're currently using. But I'm very confident that there isn't a government or an organization in the world that has, well, except perhaps Microsoft, who produces so much of their own content or their own sort of software. But most most organizations do not have a database that allows them to know what the accessibility barriers are for the technology that they're using. And that's a real oversight. And there isn't really the incentive, because procurement officers are not following up to actually dig deeply into the products and services they're buying in order to actually make sure that they're incentivizing vendors to build accessibility in by default. Justin, I don't expect you to answer that question.
With that said, we can transition. Let's go ahead and dig deeper. You all kind of started to talk about the current state of procurement and accessibility in government. And you all have really neat perspectives. Some of you work in various organizations, whereas some of you are actually within government. And so for whatever you can share, it'd be great to hear everyone's thoughts on the current state of procurement and accessibility in government. Where are we and where are we going?
Who do you think should kick this off, Pia? Because we all probably have different perspectives. Well,
Ken, go for it.
All right. Well, so when I used to be in government, when I used to be in the Department of Justice, and I was starting the Section 508 process going, this is back in 1998, 2000 time period. It was awful. But since then, I think that in general, the government is not so horrible when it comes to accessibility. Certainly compared to state and local governments, and certainly compared to the private sector. In terms of where they are in driving, in terms of using the procurement process to really facilitate the implementation of Section 508, I think that they could use a bit of help. That there are a lot of procurement officers out there who aren't really paying attention to VPATs and ACRs, and they could be doing a better job at that. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it over to now I get to pick somebody, right? How about Mike?
So, yeah, I think that the current state it's definitely something where I think that there's so, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for procurement officers. There's a lot being thrown at them, and I have not worked that side of the contracting process, but I've talked to enough people in procurement to really feel the kinds of demands that they have in order to make good decisions on behalf of the government, and there isn't. I think that in the procurement officers that I've talked to, and there's a few that I've talked to from different agencies in different countries, and there's often not enough training provided around procurement, around accessibility, around trying to make sure that there's the time available to do the assessment, that there's enough subject matter experts that allow people to be able to evaluate whether something is accessible or not. We can't expect that procurement officers are accessibility subject matter experts. On the other hand, we should expect them to be able to understand some of the basics, to be able to look at and make decisions that to not just sort of trust a VPAT on face value, or they need to be able to go beyond just the checklist of, does this have a VPAT? Because that's not sufficient to be able to enable good procurement process. It does not allow a procurement officer to validate that something meets the best meets criteria that is a legal requirement of Section 508. But I think that there's a movement afoot to change that, and I'm excited about some of the things that I've seen happen that are hopefully going to be able to change that in the future. Justin?
Yeah, I have to say I've been doing this for almost 10 years, and actually what I continue to tell people is that it's a great time to be alive, just because as we all know, there's been like the recent executive order for GSA and TTS, especially, has been doing a great job. Andrea O'Neill is the first senior advisor of equity to the administrator, and TTS is, I believe the application's closed recently, position for a DEIA tech advisor. So when it's coming from that level, it makes me really excited. And but then at the TTS level, there are a lot of great teams really working on integrating accessibility into their processes. And even for me, actually, as a contracting officer, one of my projects, in fact, is to develop, and which I'm in the process of doing right now, an accessibility and procurements guide. And again, having the support from management is a big thing compared to when I first started. And people being aware of accessibility it's phenomenal to know that sometimes, a lot of folks that I actually work with know more about it than I do, which is kind of unusual. I'm usually that blind person, and people go, okay, accessibility, sure. But now within even my workspace, and when I join and other contracting officers talking about WCAG, and I'm like, why do you know this? So to me, I think a lot of the education and training is there and it continues to be needed, but at the same time, it's coming from both directions, the grassroots level, but also from the leadership, again, to the executive order. And so, there's a lot of support and a lot of visibility on it that I think it's a great time to, like I said, it's a great time to be alive, and I'm excited to see where we can take it from here compared to when I started in this career field.
Justin, you started talking about a guide and training and whatnot, and I was just curious, and this is to all panelists, if there are any other resources that you'd recommend for folks to learn more.
I know we have a couple of good sites on TTS, like accessibility.18f.gov. There's also accessibility.digital.gov, which talks about accessibility in teams, and of course there's section 508.gov. But a lot of that with an asterisk, and I think one big thing right now we're all trying to work on is focusing on plain language, right? Like even in the contracts I work on is how can I take this section 508 language, then even for contractors, right, to be able to look at it and make sense of it, because it's just jargon, right? And so really trying to make that so people can actually understand what are we asking for. But that's what I can share, but the other panelists.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I think that a lot of entities aren't even at that point where they can use Section 508 because, say, they're in a state that doesn't have an accessibility law that requires 508. I think that one of the things that's nice about being in the federal government is you've got this federal mandate that says, that if you're a federal agency, you have to follow these accessibility standards developed by the Access Board. Some states incorporate it as just a policy. Some of them just make it into some of the states use it as state laws, and internationally, Section 508 is basically doesn't carry a whole lot of weight. The World Economic Forum's been working on has created a model IT accessibility procurement policy that I think has been in partnership with G3 ICT, that a lot of cities have been using to incorporate accessibility if they don't have a legal mandate, and have developed things like model RFP language that they can use. So even if you don't have the hammer of the federal government, you can still do these things. And I think that if you are in the United States and you do this, I think that it also goes a long way towards helping things like your Title II program access requirements, which are legally required. It's just that it doesn't spell out specifically electronic technology, but ultimately that is part of digital citizenship, which is part of your program services and activities, which is part of ADA compliance. So in the United States, it really definitely helps. So yeah, that's just another resource that's out there.
Wow, so many gems. Anything else that you'd like to add, Mike?
I've dropped in a few links in the chat that might be useful. One of the ones that one of the guides I find most useful is actually from Disability In, which is a private sector organization that it's a nonprofit that has a number of large organizations as part of that. And Lainey Feingold has actually done, I think, most of the work on trying to go off and create this procurement toolkit. So it's definitely worth looking at and seeing the efforts that have gone into that. I also wanted to pull out PeteWorks, which isn't really geared for the government agencies, but was really designed to by the Department of Labor to make it easier for other organizations to try and address accessibility. So that's another good one. And Gia, thanks for posting about 18F and the accessible.18f.gov and also accessible.digital.gov. I really do quite like the accessible by digital.gov and the role-based perspective that's being developed. Although procurement isn't in there, although it probably should be. There should be a role for procurement officers in that role-based guide. But I don't know anyone who's done that at this stage.
All right. Well, so many gems, and panelists, feel free to drop more resources in the chat of anything that you mentioned. With that, I was excited to also kind of dig into ideas or interesting solutions around solving the barriers across the enterprise around technology procurement and accessibility. And so with that said, what exists and what needs to exist?
I've got something to plug if that's okay.
Please do.
So I just posted this in the chat. It's a OpenACR, which is a project that we worked on with the GSA, and this was basically to take the VPAT and to turn it into a modern machine-readable procurement document that allowed that was following sort of best practices of the World Wide Web Consortium and also building on some of the efforts from NIST to try and organize security through the OSCAL format. And so we've tried to create a machine-readable format that allows that automates the process, or that simplifies the process of creating ACRs and allows vendors to be able to more easily create meaningful ACRs, but also to do that in an open format that would allow for other people to go back and forth. So you could get an ACR from a vendor in an open ACR format. You could identify some mistakes that they've made. You could then add an edit to an ACR and create a modification of that and send it back to them to say, here's some things we saw that you missed. We'd like you to address these points because they were not covered in your ACR. And I think that when vendors are doing an evaluation of their product, even the big companies, like they don't evaluate all of the pages. They probably evaluate 10 or 20 of the key pages that they need to do, and have that be, those might be evaluated by a professional organization like DQ or Level Access, but they're not going to be something where a vendor, even a big vendor, isn't going to evaluate the entire site. So there are going to be things that are missed. So let's just assume that we build in a feedback loop into the process that allows them to do this. This isn't officially supported by or required through section 508.gov, and it's not even officially recommended, but it's up on the GSA website and sorry, on the GSA GitHub page. It's something that I'm hoping that section 508.gov will be officially endorsing at some point in the near future.
All right. Way to kick that off. Any other ideas or interesting solutions?
Well, actually, I mean, that's one of the things that brought the conversation about OpenACR is one of the things that connected me and Mike a couple of months ago, because there was a time back in 2009 where I was asked to create a open machine-readable VPAT format. And the VPAT's basically well, the ACR is now the VPAT, basically. Once you fill out a VPAT, it's an ACR. So
sorry, Ken, sorry to stop you. Can you debunk the acronym?
Oh, sure. So VPAT is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. It was created by the Information Technology Industry Council and in partnership with GSA. And it was a template that basically just reports on conformance with the standards. So back in 2000, it conformed to the 2000 standards. When the Section 508 standards were updated to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the VPAT was updated to meet the format of the new Section 508 standards. And then there got into a long story about like who owns the VPAT. Do you have to conform exactly to the format of the VPAT? Lots of back and forth until finally people said, you know, once you fill out a VPAT, it might not be officially a VPAT. So now we're going to call that thing an Accessibility Conformance Report, or an ACR. But before this whole kerfuffle, we used to always call a VPAT a VPAT. But now we call a completed VPAT an ACR. Okay, whatever. So, so with that said, back in 2009, I was asked by the ITI, Information Technology Industry Council, which is the trade group of all the big IT companies in the world, the Microsofts, the HPs, the Samsungs, everybody like that, to create an open format VPAT that was machine readable, but would also be human readable. And so to do that, I created an XML based format. Everybody liked it. We created an XLST style sheet to make sure that it was human readable. So it looks like a VPAT on when you bring it up in your browser, but you look at the source code and it's all XML. XML's kind of antiquated now. People don't like it. And so, you know, fast forward, we could have gone with JSON, instead ended up with YAML, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, so it gets a little bit complicated. The point is, though, that my project really didn't go anywhere. And I think that Mike and I have been talking about, like, well, how do we make sure that yours actually succeeds? And I think it's a wonderful idea. The sticking point I see, though, is with trying to get industry to meet yet another format, because around the world we've got governments that are asking for the ACR or things that are like the ACR in all these different formats. And then sometimes we have variations on that. So for instance, Japan's version of WCAG is slightly different from the American version of WCAG. And so we have to tweak that. If GSA can work with the world governments to promote this as a universal format, you know, that would be pretty cool. So that way you could save industry the burden of creating all these different formats for all these different governments around the world. But at the end of the day, I think that really it comes down to a people problem, not a technology problem. I think that there are entities that are very dedicated to accessibility that do a really good job using the ACR as it is. And it's a matter of trying to put the burden in the right places, make sure you've got the right contract language and things like that. And yeah, I think that's it almost seems as though from watching GSA over the years, it seemed as though they were always trying to create new tools for accessibility. And it almost got to the point of a hammer in search of a nail. It was just, when really the big problem was trying to incentivize the procurement officers that this isn't a hard thing to do. and that there are certain basic things that they should be doing as part of the procurement process to make all this stuff happen. And I think of examples like, CSU does a great job, and the thing that they use is ACRs, and they figured out a way to do this without them all becoming experts in accessibility and making it fairly simple for themselves without largely putting the burden of accessibility on the vendors, which I think is really where it should be.
Thank you for that. Justin, is there anything you can share around ideas, or interesting solutions, or anything around just solving around the barriers?
And I know one of the themes we talked about is just really including the right people from the beginning and throughout the process. I mean, that's the big thing for me as a contracting officer, just making sure I'm not a technical person. So who's the appropriate technical folks who would know this? Or how can I get the right training or appropriate level that, I can make those kind of decisions, and not just, again, at the beginning, but throughout the process, holding ourselves, as a government, as well as our contractors accountable. And what does that look like, right? And yes, using the correct tools and, seeing what's out there. And like I said, pre-award, but also post-award, because at any point in time, you can make a change and something's all of a sudden broken. So just really keeping that in mind and really just normalizing accessibility in that way, so that it's not something we even have to think about anymore, because it just is.
I love what you said about normalizing accessibility. And with that, if you had a magic wand and you could make any changes or improvements, what would you do around procurement and accessibility?
Yeah, actually, funny enough, I would normalize accessibility like everyone does breathing. So when you're not, something isn't accessible or broken and you can't breathe, then you start wondering, why am I not breathing? Oh, that's why. That's what my magic wand would be. So every time somebody's not doing something, they have a sense that they can breathe, and it'll make them wonder, how can they fix it before, actually doing what they need to do or moving on.
All right, Mike or Ken, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Go for it, Ken.
I was hoping you'd go first.
Okay,
All right,
I'll go first.
Well, I could do it.
Okay, good.
All right, you didn't want to go first either. Okay, as long as we're honest with each other.
Exactly.
Well, I remember when I was at Justice, we used to do a 508 survey every 2 years, and I really wish that had not stopped. Because I think that was one of the things that created one of those incentives for government agencies to try and do their best in accessibility. So, for instance, we would ask questions like, well, and if I were doing this again, I'd ask questions like, well, if you're as part of your IT procurements, do you include such and such model language in your RFPs to make sure that your vendors provide a detailed ACR? And then we would, the answers, you could tell which one was the model practice. So it's usually answer A that said, yes, we always do this as part of our procurement. And answer B would say, well, that's a really great idea. We're thinking about it, and we'll probably do it within the next year or two. And answer C would be, well, maybe we'll do it. And answer D is go jump in a lake. And nobody wants to tell the DOJ that you're to tell them to go jump in a lake. So everybody chooses one of the other answers. And as you monitor the results over time, you can see that people are migrating towards the better and better answer. So that would help. And then also, it's in terms of the follow-up, I think one of the things that can happen is, and again, I'm going to use CSU as an example. In your RFP, you would ask for things like a demonstration of certain key user tasks that are essential as part of a product that you're buying. So for instance, if you're buying a word processor, are you able to do the tasks of opening a document, making a correction in the document, spell checking the document, and saving it? And that would be a user task. Can you do those tasks using assistive technology? And be prepared to demonstrate it. And if, before you get the award, you may be required to demonstrate that. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on a vendor who has no idea about accessibility. And that makes them think hard about what they're going to put into their ACR to begin with. So it incentivizes the vendor to do the right thing, and it also makes it easy for a procurement officer to understand whether those user tasks can be done without themselves becoming a master and using NVDA, for instance. So I think things like that, I think, would also really help. But there's got to be some way of incentivizing.
Want you to break that down, NVDA.
Oh, non-visual desktop access, which is a screen reader. It's a free screen reader used by people who are blind and who have visual impairments.
Thank you. All right. Magic wand. Anything else?
So
anything is possible.
I would say that I take insights from the what's successfully done elsewhere in the world, and I get Europe's doing some really amazing things. Not so much on procurement, actually. They're still behind the U.S. on procurement, but when it comes to the Web Accessibility Directive, they've done some amazing work on trying to make sure that there's accessibility monitoring that's being done, and also to build in feedback loops. And I think that those two elements are really critical to any successful accessibility program. And I think that this can be extended to try and look at how does that feed into the procurement process. Because if we know that through monitoring that sites that are being developed with, say, SharePoint are less accessible than sites that are being developed through Drupal, and I'm very biased on this as a Drupal core accessibility maintainer, but we should be able to go off and say, if you buy a less accessible product, you are going to have more costs expected down the line, and that these accessibility costs cannot be externalized by people with disabilities or other people who are losing opportunities based on that. I'd love to see feedback loops so that when people are coming to websites and using the websites, whether that's as a public servant trying to go off and engage with the back end of a tool, or whether it's a public citizen, that feedback is something that actually gets collected and organized and prioritized and fed back up the system so that it can be fixed. Either maybe it's a local theme issue, maybe it's something that's a customization issue, or maybe it's an issue with the core libraries that are used. So maybe it's part of the procurement process, and then it goes right back, and that there's a chain of accountability from the users to the people who produce the source libraries that we're depending on, that we're all depending on. I'd also love to see ATAG as being part of the procurement process. That's not something that we're seeing at all, but ATAG is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. And it's a really important part of the framework, because most accessibility errors these days are produced by authors who do not know accessibility, because they're hired as writers or as subject matter experts. They're not hired as accessibility experts. How do we give them the tools that allows them to create accessible content? And again, all of this stuff is not part of general procurement language, and it can be. We can start building that in so that this is something that we can make substantial improvements if we're able to go off and build these into our legal binding agreements with vendors.
Thank you for that. Anything else? You have a magic wand. Anything is possible.
Yeah, Mike, I like the idea of ATAG, building that into the accessibility requirements, especially because so many sites are developed with content management systems where the authoring tools are just, they don't provide the accessibility features. But then there are also some that do. And so how do you hold the content author's feet to the fire in terms of making sure that before they hit submit, that that thing that they're about to submit is actually checked for basic things like, are there textual description of images, or is your heading structure in the right order? Things like that.
But in some ways, that's an easy thing to fix as well. So for like with most of us use Office. Office has a built-in accessibility checker that should be enabled by default. And if you had a big enough contract, like how many government departments are there that are buying Microsoft products, they could say, we need to have this enabled by default so that it's available. They could also say, we want to have Microsoft Office be able to give us some information about how accessible the documents are that are being produced by our staff. So that could be pushed up the chain. So there's actually an accountability structure put into place so that the people who are creating inaccessible documents on a regular basis, maybe they have to go to a remediation class. Maybe there's a way to build that into the accounting process. But you can, if you have the tools in place that allow you to go off and to identify what is broken in the process, then you can address that. Maybe it's training, maybe it's an additional support, maybe it's having content be audited by, if it's being produced by certain people, so that it's being evaluated appropriately. But we can address these issues. I also posted in some information about the We for Authors cluster, which was a process that I was involved in with the Drupal, Plone, Joomla, and a few other CMSs, looking at how do we build best practices. And the European Union was realizing that there were challenges with trying to meet their the EN 301549 standards, and if they built accessibility in using things like ATAG, it would be much easier. So they were trying to encourage content management systems to build in accessibility. And frankly, like this happened because this project happened because the European Commission funded it to make it happen. And governments need to be funding the development of these kinds of standards and this type of documentation. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be open, and it needs to be more readily available and written in plain language.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. We're going to go ahead and transition now to question and answer. So if you haven't done so already, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature. With that said, let's go ahead and jump on in. All right. Julia Edinger asked, what can smaller agencies like local government agencies that may not have access to the same resources as federal government agencies do to implement some of these improvements?
I'm going to jump in there because I've been dealing a lot with smaller government agencies recently. We all mentioned, Mike and I both mentioned different resources for governments to use in terms of implementing an accessibility policy as part of your procurements. One of the things that I think is that I've been noticing a lot coming up recently as I'm scanning through the different contracts that are being issued by state and local governments is that there are a lot of contracts for website development, and almost none of them include provision for how you're going to incorporate accessibility. Or if they do say accessibility, it just says in some bland, overly broad language, how do you intend to make the website that you're going to provide for us conform to WCAG, and they just say, they don't tell you what level of WCAG, they don't tell you what they mean. And then when you go back to that procurement officer and you say, by the way, we're an accessibility consultant, is there any way that would you consider, say, partnering with us to help make sure that the thing that your vendor is providing is actually accessible? And usually they give us the cold shoulder. I think that the vendor has got to prove that the thing that they're providing to you is accessible, because 9 times out of 10, when you ask them, when you ask a vendor to provide something like that and they don't know anything about accessibility, they won't give it a lot of attention towards it. Now, that's not true for the big companies. Like if you ask HP or Microsoft or one of the really big organizations, hey, what do you do about accessibility for this thing that you're selling us? There's a good chance that that they actually are going to meet up with it. But for a lot of the smaller vendors, that's not true. They're only interested in trying to get that sale, and it won't ultimately be accessible.
Anyone else want to add to that?
The one thing I'd add is that there's one of the great things that the UK is doing is they're actually trying to provide support for all governments in the UK. So there's actually a community of practice that they're trying to build that is across government agencies, across different boundaries or different sort of different regional or municipal levels within the UK. And I think that that'd be a really useful step forward, because it is a journey to deal with accessibility. And if you're not able to do that on your own, if you're not able to find an ally in your department to be able to reach out and to get people who can learn a little bit about accessibility and join some mailing lists and take on the practice of building up a small practice area within your municipality.
All right. Well, our next question comes from Martha Wilkes. Do you have any standard language we can steal and or borrow to add to request for proposals that is about accessibility beyond mere 508 compliance?
And do you have any?
I was thinking of trying to come up with some, but it was really all about demonstrating the fact in an RFP, making sure that the vendor is on notice that they may have to demonstrate the use of a product with assistive technology, and you name what the assistive technology is, whether it's JAWS or NVDA, and performing these basic tasks. And I think I think that would do a pretty good job of putting vendors on notice that they really have to either know what they're doing or hire somebody that knows what they're doing to help them make sure that their product is accessible.
I posted I was trying to go to address this exact question, Martha, and so years ago I set up a GitHub repo trying to collect best practices of examples of a language that was being used, and I haven't seen anything else that's quite like this, but I not that this is well maintained or an ultimate guide, but it's certainly a place to start looking for appropriate language. And it's a GitHub repo with a few different examples.
Where did you put that, Mike?
Oh, it should be in the chat.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, got it. Right.
And by the way, in the chat, Martha also added that I'm thinking more of finding vendors who get it. I will dig in. Thanks. Anything else? All right. Moving on to the next question. Our next question comes from, an apology in advance if I am butchering your name, Michal Perlstein. How do you recommend putting the onus on the vendor to prove that their product is accessible? It seems that vendors claim that they are, and then expect the client to perform accessibility testing and finally have no structure in place to resolve errors.
I guess I'm the one that's supposed to answer that because I keep talking about the vendor demonstration, right? So, okay, using CSU as an example again. We were involved in several procurements with them. And we've worked with CSU between Jeff and I, we've worked with CSU for almost 2 decades now. And but most recently, we've been doing it with regard to their procurements. And so they would include in their RFP that the requirement for it, that they have to have an ACR developed, and that the vendor would have to demonstrate the accessibility features in their product. either they would have to do it or they would have to hire somebody that knows assistive technology to do it. And so we were on CSU's trusted list of vendors. And several companies contacted us and they said, we don't know anything about accessibility. We're a small chatbot manufacturer, for instance, and can you help us out? And so we would evaluate the product and help them create their ACR. We would identify where the weaknesses are, and then they would come back. We would go back. We would tell them about where the weaknesses are in their product. They would fix their product and we would make sure that it was a accessible product. It didn't mean that it was perfectly accessible. It just meant that it was pretty darn good. And then we would run through the demonstration of the various steps of the things that CSU asked us to do. In this case, it was a chatbot. Open up the chatbot, ask about, say, financial services, availability of financial services, financial aid, I'm sorry, for me. And then the chatbot would say, are you in state or out of state? And we would say in state. So they would guide us through what the conversation should be. And so that was one of the user steps. And so the vendor hired us to do exactly that using JAWS and NBVA with CSU and the procurement team there before CSU would award that contract. So it really was a case of just placing that burden on the vendor to make sure that the product was accessible. Now, that really only works if it's a really big procurement. If it's a small procurement, then vendors are probably not going to think it's worth the time of day to put into that much effort and hiring a consultant like us to do all those steps for them. But I think it's a much easier way of doing it than having CSU have to have to have a team of people that were watching the vendor and making sure that to independently evaluate the product. I think that's a much taller ask, and it would only be really a process that would be usable by organizations that have a lot of expertise themselves in accessibility, when most state and local governments don't have a whole team of people like that, like CSU does. CSU just got lazy. They just thought, okay, we'll just put the burden on the vendor to do this instead of doing all the testing in the house, because that was really causing a bottleneck for us.
I would say that there's also, I'm a big proponent of open source software. And if you have open source software, you can have an open issue queue, and you can have issue queues that are tagged with accessibility. And that way you can have that degree of transparency and openness, have that sort of feedback between users and of the product and the vendors as well. So that's another way to try and provide, to put the onus on the vendors to validate their claims.
We have time for one last question. So Jonathan Murray asked, Mike, is there a way we can include UI UX feedback loop for ACRs that's crowdsourced through different disability communities to comment on tools?
The best that I can think about, I mean, there's no system that I know to go up and to crowdsource that type of information. There are agencies that are starting to organizations that are trying to go off and to do more professional user testing for people with disabilities. And Fable's one, it's Fable Tech Labs is a great new company that's done quite a lot to try and make it easier for people to evaluate and to test accessibility with a range of different people with disabilities, and to have professional feedback from that. So I would recommend them, but that's as close as I can come to trying to resolve that question.
All right. Well, we are almost at time. And so for just some closing thoughts, definitely copy and paste any links from this chat. It may be available for a little while after the session, but to be extra safe, so many great resources shared. And as I also mentioned in the chat, if you'd like to keep in touch, I've also included everyone's LinkedIn page. And anything else, panelists?
Justin, do you want the last word?
No, thank you guys. I mean, I took a lot away from that as well. So this was great. Thank you guys so much.
Yes, this has been a very informative session. Thank you for sharing and helping folks learn more about procuring accessibility technology. And there's just so much actionable insights and resources shared. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. And if I recall, today's the last day of the summit, and we hope to see you again next year. Thanks, everyone.
And I hope everyone has a happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day tomorrow.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll post in the chat more about that. Thanks, everyone. Take care.